have a company called Trusted Systems, and we are in the physical security of classified networks. Has been our business for 30, 35 years. But today we're going to be talking about a subject that has been getting fairly little attention. We've been at it for quite a few years, but with a lot of things that have been going on, it's been, particularly with the hacks that have been going on and some of the breaches that we've had, this is a particular spot, the endpoint, that we would like to focus our attention on today. A little bit about where I came from, because a lot of it has to do with the subject we have here. It's one that just doesn't keep going away because the problem really never quite gets solved. I had, I guess I'm the oldest one in the room, so I'm the dinosaur here, but I was blessed to start my career out in Northern California back in the late 60s, early 70s, when Silicon Valley was just coming alive. And man, it was exciting. It was a tremendous environment. Boy, you're working all the time, and it just was electric. And it was a wonderful time to be there. But it was a very formative time as well, and just a lot going on in terms of technology and in terms of the area that I am more involved in, which is marketing and creating markets. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit out there, and it was something that kind of forged my career early on. I had started working with General Electric Company. They told me, either you're going to be an entrepreneur and stay here 5 years and go out and either go to a smaller company or start your own business, or you're going to be with us for 30, 40 years, and you'll set in as being a corporate person. Well, I did the former, but the area that I had chosen was in the computer peripheral area, particularly having to do with what they called at the time the man-machine interface. And there's a lot of jargon and a lot of vocabulary that's changed over the years, but the real critical element of this is that as technology keeps going off the charts, and we're going to track some of that in a minute, the user interface stays the same. People still type it up to 100 words a minute, and they're still either using, back then, of course, it was teletype machines and paper tape readers, and I know I'm dating myself here, and computers were, huge. They filled up a room. But the whole concept was that it was a matter of how you dealt with information, how you communicated it, how you interacted with it. And so what we had looked at was, as my career evolved, from there I had moved down to Phoenix, Arizona, and I had become a VAR for what was then a small company called Sun Microsystems. And we started out with them. That was back in 1986. We were VAR number 4. It was pretty humble. But what it led me to was our biggest account, Los Alamos Labs, had a problem. Disk drives, of course, then, the speeds were going up, the processing power, memory, and everything were going off the charts, and form factors were starting to come down. But the real problem in a classified environment was, how do you secure data? At that point, they had big fixed removable disk drives. And they put them into a safe at night, and then in the day they'd come back to use them. And we were involved with selling. I was also a distributor for Fujitsu disk drives at the time, the old big clunky, what they called SMD drives. And they were, of course, the one this big is like a whopping 400 megabytes, so you can imagine. But what happened is IBM came out with what they called the Winchester disk drive, which is now affectionately known as the hard drive. And their first iteration was an 8-inch form factor. And security all of a sudden became a problem, because if you don't have fixed removable, how do you get the drive off? How do you get the classified piece of the data to get into the vault? So they came to me and they said, we'd like to have a removable hard drive. At that point, removability was a 45-pound box that didn't even include the power supply, so that was kind of untenable. But when I asked them, I said, well, where do you put it at night? And they said, well, we put it in this safe from Mosler. And I said, well, let me take a look at it. So the SPARC that actually, I didn't know it at the time, and I guess you never really do, is, I said, well, we've been building all these disk subsystems and systems with Sun. Why don't we just build the equipment inside of the safe and merge the two? The phrase then was, instead of bringing Mohammed to the mountain, bring the mountain to Mohammed. Have it run as an integral part. And from there we started what became known as the IPS security container. At the time, it's basically, from a functional point of view, what we refer to as an armored computer cabinet. And that's been the genesis of what got to be a path of discovery, of looking at the endpoint of a network, and particularly as networks go and explode, this becomes more and more important because you become more and more detached. So from that point on, it took me 5 years to get GSA to even look at it, because it was a different kind of a GSA-approved security container. Got approval in 1992, and then we've been marketing it ever since. But all along the way, there had always been this consistent issue of, what do you do about the user interface? And what do you do about, as technology keeps growing and speeds keep growing and response times keep growing and the dependency on computer keeps growing, what happens? You end up having bigger and bigger problems, higher and higher risks and vulnerabilities that people don't look at, because everybody's looking at all the equipment, they're looking at the communications. And at the same time, you went through where you were holding this. Now, what I want to do is kind of frame the problem in where it exists today. And then we're going to kind of go back a little bit in time and track how the technology evolved, because that really tells you where things have been. We can see where they are, but it also can help us a little bit to see where they're going. Now, the other issue is, then I want to take a look at some of the alternatives, because this is an ongoing problem. And I think that we need to be able to look at how we evaluate it and how we check it out. Well, when AFCEA came to me and said, we've got this Security Plus compliant course, and I said, what do you want me to talk about, or what's the criteria? These were the factors that were involved. And lo and behold, I looked at them, and they're exactly the same criteria that I'd used in 1991, because the other half of the equation is to develop a product, but at the same time, you have to develop a market, right? And if it took me 5 years just to get GSA to look at it, clearly they weren't going to give me any direction as to where the market was. So I had to go to practitioners, people like yourself. And I realized very early on that that's where the source of information, the source of ideas, the source of where we need to be taking the product. And we just got more and more honed into this whole point of endpoint security. Now, as we go forward, the real issue is this. Security used to have electronic warfare. There used to be, now it's evolved into cybersecurity is the latest term. And I think it's still trying to find its domain. It's trying to find its definition. But cybersecurity works from the inside out. It's looking at traffic patterns, it's looking at behavior, it's looking at persistent threat and analysis. But it's always, in a sense, counting the horses after they're out of the barn, or looking for the next threat and then trying to react to it. Or just like with antiviral software, and every week you have Zipper Tuesday with Microsoft coming out with their latest patches, and whoosh, everybody's got to update their stuff, and that's a continual process. But the problem with the physical security side of it, which is what we're going to be concentrating on today, is the fact that when you build a SCIF or a CAA or any kind of a secured room, the security criteria and the specs and the policies stop at the wall. They don't go to the desktop. There's a gap there. And the gap is something that is now becoming more and more critical because of the fact that they leave the family jewels very vulnerable. And that's the network equipment inside the room. Initially, SCIFs were when they had the big mainframe computers, it was a fishbowl and everything worked within it. Back then, you brought in punched cards, they ran a program, they give you a printed output, but everything stayed within the confines of this, what evolved into a SCIF, Special Compartmented Information Facility. Well, the problem was technology started to explode. And what did it do? It got out of the SCIF. You got into networking. We're going to track that a little bit here in a second. And so what happened was the equipment that's left inside wasn't protected. As long as you were cleared and vetted, you were in. I give you Bradley Manning, I give you Edward Snowden. Because they had free, unfettered access once they were in the SCIF. So it's that wall to the desktop is the area of concern. And that's where insider threats are the big threat that we face today, and it's ongoing. And it's something that either policy or practice has not really addressed. And that's why I'm here today. Now, when I looked at how to evaluate this and how to look at it, there are several key factors here that we have to look at that we'll be talking about as we go through, but I just wanted to highlight them up front. The first one is space. A SCIF doesn't protect equipment, it protects space, a room. And you're allowed to do whatever you want within the room. However, what's happened is that the function of a SCIF or this function of a CAA or a cleared area has changed. It's now a network portal. It's not just a room. So now you have a problem with what do you do about the not only the space that's inside, but how do you secure that equipment, and also how do you control the people that are using it. So space becomes an important factor. Time is another factor, response time. We're living in a real-time world. And we're, in fact, Terry Halverson was talking about this yesterday at lunch, that they were looking at how do you, first of all, value the data that you're dealing with, but also manage it. And time is always a critical factor in that. Now, the other thing, of course, which is the big uncertainty in most of these, is people and how they behave and how you manage them and how you get them to be disciplined enough to handle the data they should be, and how do you control it. And that's another factor. The other one is scale. It's one thing when you're dealing with everything in one room, or you're dealing with LAN that may have 50 or 100 users. It's another thing when you end up with now the internet and you're worldwide and you've got literally millions of users, and you have to deal with the scale of the problem and where it goes. And then how you cope with the change, because we have cybersecurity on one side and we have physical security on the other, and we have technology. Technology adapts to change very readily. They drive it. But security doesn't. They lag. and particularly physical security. That's kind of been a foster child of the industry because it ends up where all the attention goes to cybersecurity. They're really kind of looking from the inside out. We're really wanting to go from the outside in. And then the last thing, which was also what Terry had brought up, is you want to follow the data. Where does it reside? In old days, all the data was in a SCIF, and it was in a mainframe, and then it went to mini computers, and then it went to microcomputers, and then the data was distributed out into a networked environment. Now we're getting into the cloud environment, and now it's starting to come back into big mega data centers, but you've got to follow the data. Now, this is pretty much the history and the story of what has happened and what the vulnerabilities have been. This is just a review of some of the cases, but what I wanted you to note is the timeline. This goes all the way back to the 60s. In other words, since computing has evolved, there have been threats. And predominantly, they have been the insider threat. The whole concept of physical security was the KGB cat burglar, and we had the bipolar, US-Soviet kind of environment. But what happened was that wasn't the real threat, because they built safes strong enough. They built locks that worked well enough to keep people out. But it was the insider, the guy who was authorized to be in, that was the real threat. And so as we went through, you can look at each of these and you can determine the vulnerabilities that were there and latent. And when you look at it from a cyber point of view, as I said, you're always reacting to something that happened. What really has to happen is there has to be a proactive effect of physically controlling the endpoint to be able to at least provide an additional buffer, an additional layer of defense in this environment. Now, when you talk about the world of IT and you talk about the world of physical security, you have, of course, C4I is how they evolve, and it used to be C3, and now it's C4ISR, I guess. But on the physical security side, you're dealing with a whole different mentality, what I call G3D, guns, gates, guards, and dogs, okay? And the people that are looking at the criteria of like how my safes are looked at, they're only concerned about the lock. So I'm dealing with having to get evaluated by locksmiths when there's a whole IT world out there, and the information that's now stored in a safe is in terabytes. It's not just a few thousand pieces of paper. And so there is a big dichotomy of a real dynamic environment on the IT side, a real static environment on the physical security side. And then one, of course, is driven by technology. The other is driven by the facility, because the real albatross around your neck is the fact that either with a SCIF or with PDS, with conduit, with drop boxes and padlocks and all this other stuff, it's tied to the facility. It's not tied to the network. And that's one of the big issues that we're facing today. One, of course, moves at the speed of light, the other at the speed of a glacier. They don't react or adapt to change very much, but they also have been in the background. They just get pushed off to the side. So now all the attention money goes to cybersecurity, as it should, because certainly hacking and the ability getting in has been a big problem. But with the IT world, you're dealing with online information sharing, and in the physical security world, you're dealing with offline containment. You're dealing with how you physically just protect things, but you're really not in a sense, because the SCIF, whatever you have now, is really a network portal. It's not an enclave that just is closed unto itself. So this becomes a real issue. Now, networks, of course, go to expanded access. Physical people want to limit it. With that, you end up with quite a dichotomy here. And I'm often quoting, as the World Series is on, I like to quote Yogi Berra. So our corporate mission has been from then, when we come to a fork in the road, we take it, okay? And that's what we're doing here. What we've been trying to do as a company for 30 years now is to bridge that gap between these two very diverse cultures and see what we can do. Now, cybersecurity, of course, is somewhere in the middle because there is a physical security component to it, and then there is the human factor and the software side of looking at it from the inside out. But in government, the guardrails are put on by the physical security people. The facility people are the ones that control the environment. And so, because they don't react quickly to change, they don't react quickly to technology, they're always the tail wagging the dog. And because they're grounded to the facility, there's an advantage that it's non-intelligent. It's a physical barrier you can count on. But I'll tell you what, you cannot solve the problem if it is an IT-based problem, if it's a people problem once you're inside that facility. And so this is something where, from an IT point of view, which of course dominates the culture, and the real important problem with this is we're becoming more and more dependent on it as time goes on. So it becomes a bigger factor. And as time goes on, we become more dependent on it. We start putting all our eggs in one basket, if you will, and what happens? When you get had, you really get had. So when Bradley Manning's sitting in a tent or a building out in Afghanistan, and he's wide open to 10 years of State Department traffic. In fact, it's kind of a personal thing because my brother was in the Foreign Service in the State Department, and he had some of his cables when he was based in Pakistan. He was the Consul General in Karachi. He couldn't believe that some of it came back to haunt him because a lot of it was traffic that was reports about particular people that probably could be embarrassing. So the consequences of this happening, even though the likelihood may be low, the consequences are huge. Edward Snowden, we don't even have to mention that in terms of the consequences, and we still may even be seeing it because now you get into sources and methods, you get into all kinds of things within the intel community that not only get embarrassing, but they cost lives. This is not something to kid around with, and a lot of it has to do with how you deal with the endpoint. Now, the fact that we have this total dependency then really means the higher you go, the further you fall, the more vulnerable you become. And the real heart of the problem then is people and how they are managed, how they are controlled. Right now, it's done in software, managing passwords and permissions. It's controlled by the facility, and it's controlled by the network itself, how the network's laid out and how it's controlled. But the endpoint isn't controlled. It's still vulnerable. And that's the real key to it. So what we look at is providing a proactive response, providing access control at the desktop that can now positively prevent someone from getting in the first place. And that's kind of where we're going. Now, the saying wanted to go through a little bit of the background. When you look at where things have gone, particularly I'm going to break it down into two parts. The first part is from the 60s to 1990, roughly. And the second part is from 90 and beyond. And you can see here by how we went in such a short period of time. Of course, vacuum tubes and transistors were around since the 40s. But my goodness, going up to 1971 in the space of 30 years, look what technology brought us. And with that, all that power and all that speed and all that performance and all that data and information to manage, it also brought us the risks along with it. So we went from mainframes to minis to microcomputers to PCs Now we're into laptops and we're into tablets, and we're even looking at dealing with smartphones now. Bring your own device kind of environment. So as the technology has shot off, you also had parallel growths in operating systems, access applications, what you can do with it. However, in around 1990, turns out that was a very pivotal time. First of all, the wall came down. So our perception of security and the threat was this KGB cat burglar. It's kind of funny because when my safe is tested, all right, they assume that they have a guy with 150 pounds of tools that he brings into a room with his stethoscope around his neck and he starts trying to break into the safe. That's the mentality that they had back then. But meanwhile, once 1990 happened, right at that time, there was a network out called ARPANET, which was the first precursor of the internet. And that was actually done with universities and research labs to share scientific data. But that grew into the World Wide Web. So you not only had the threat changing, you went from the bipolar Soviet threat, you went to terrorism, which was there all along. We just didn't fully recognize it. We also, from a funding point of view, thought we had a peace dividend since this was over. So our eyes were not kept on the ball in terms of intelligence gathering, particularly human. So right at 1990, several things had happened. Another thing had happened. Up to that point, the driving engine for technological development was controlled by the Intel community. Starting in the 30s with Alan Turing, computers were really designed for first World War II and then the Soviet threat to look at cryptographic analysis and code breaking. That's what drove the engine. IBM, NCR, others, that's how funneled the demand or the need for it. But when that kind of died out, basically government lost its lead in driving technology and it shifted over to the commercial world, to industry, where they started looking at their own encryption algorithms. They started looking at their own way of managing data. And now you can see with what's happened, particularly with the Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks, and you now have this whole explosive social media out there, but you also have these mega centers, these data centers, that really evolved from, instead of one big mainframe computer, you now have tens of thousands of servers that all interact with each other. And so the focus up to 1990 was basically processing. Managing data, you had a control over it. But after that, it started looking at connectivity. It started looking at the network. And so that is what really happened. So in the 90s, we had these things going on in terms of the threats, the technology, the attitude in America where the funding was going and where it was not going. And then from there, really at the beginning of the computer industry, you had the whole hacking environment coming into play, which is a threat we're still trying to deal with. And we're still playing catch-up ball. And it'll be a continual battle. It's not going to go away. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to take the specific classified networks that the government developed. We were involved, in fact, Fifth Signal Command stood up SIPRNet in 1995. And they were the first activity to do the field testing on it. And we were involved in providing security for that. So we've been tracking these networks. And then it was SIPR and NIPR. And then, of course, JWICS up in the TSSCI realm is still hamstrung because you have to be in a SCIF. So the price of entry to get a JWICS terminal is right about $500,000. And so there's a practicality and affordability to all this, but there's also, from a physical security point of view, constraints that withhold your ability to communicate. Because as time goes on with the technology, the data goes on, it becomes more critical, again, looking at scale, of we're now in a real-time world. We're looking at telemetry. We're looking at particularly battlefield conditions where you have to make decisions instantly, where time is a real factor. And so the response time is very critical, the ability to make decisions. What Terry Halverson was talking about yesterday, having the right data at the right place at the right time, becomes very critical. But yet you have to do it securely. So this is the area that we're starting to focus on. Now, we then went into the mobile world, which is kind of exacerbating it because, see, people are the real security problem. And what you try to do is you try to, either through discipline or through constraints, force them to behave and work a certain way so that they will adhere to security policy and that you aren't vulnerable. But also, when you have mobility in here, and there's kind of a balance that we have to look at, and that is the balance between security and convenience. Because we have all this technology that we want to use. But the problem we have is that it's all left up to the human being and his behavior and his attitude and his discipline and his motivations as to how secure that data is going to end up being. There were laptops that they stood up in Europe where E6s and above could carry them around, and they were doing SIPRNet in airports. But it's all up to the individual. And all they had to do was sign a paper saying, I'll be a good boy or girl. So you have to experiment with this. You have to go out and push the envelope because there is an urgency to have data available when and where you need it. But there has to be some constraints in terms of how you secure it. So that coupled with the fact that technology is roaring along. We now have these mega data centers so that access now can be instantaneous around the world. But we have a whole nother technology on the horizon, and that's quantum computing. And of course, you have the technology evolving, but then you have to have the countermeasures and the security to protect it. So you need quantum-resistant encryption, because the problem with computers, which is not a problem with safes, and this is the fine line, this is the fork in the road that we're taking here and we're trying to blend together. The problem with the computer is you can use its intelligence against itself. It's a leapfrogging game of back and forth of trying to identify what the next threat is going to be, and the hackers or rogue states or nation states are trying to say, okay, how do we break in? How do we get your 21 million of OPM data? In fact, I just took a list of all the hacks that have happened and the volume of our data that's now spread throughout the world in terms of the Yahoo hacks. Equifax just came up, 145 million people. And you look at all these, and some of these were just incredible hacks. One that comes to mind is with Target. They literally hacked every home within a 10, 20-mile radius around their headquarters in Atlanta, every PC in every home, hoping that someone would bring a thumb drive home to do work at home. And I think it took them like 18 months of just monitoring this. They found it, and they got in, and they exploited it. And Target ended up with an $18 million fine, but they got hacked. How many million people did they get? It's 110 million. So we're dealing with a very, very pervasive threat, and there's always a constant cat and mouse game of going back and forth of what is going to be the next threat and reacting to it. That's the intelligence being used against itself. The nice thing about a security container is it's the dumbest thing in the room. It has no intelligence. You either know the combination or you're not getting in. So we're trying to blend that physical presence along with how you manage the user interface to allow you to have a proactive form of security that can allow you to move forward. Now, There are two other aspects of this. One is the technology, the IT, the information technology itself. The second part of it is you have the user interface. I've just described physical security. It's kind of going along like this. Technology is going up off the charts. But physical security stays the same. We still want a SCIF. We still want PDS. We still want a Dropbox, regardless of what the technology that you're dealing with. And now it hamstrings your ability to perform, and it also creates these vulnerabilities at the endpoint that we've described. But even though there have been a few changes, flat panel displays, touch screens, the user interface is still fundamentally the same as it was in the 80s. It's a keyboard, monitor, mouse. Now, as you get into mobility and as you get to go around, some of your data you'll be using in a mobile environment. You may check your email. You may do certain things that are spot response to keeping track of what's going on at the office. But fundamentally, the volume of data is still managed at the desktop. And so that's the environment that we're dealing with. And that's what we're looking at right now. The other thing that's added to that I might say is we're not just dealing with data, we're also dealing with VTC terminals, we're dealing with voice in terms of voice over IP phones. And how do you secure this? And how do you manage it from a single desktop to be able to make it work? Now, the way we came about it is what we call an information security processing container. When I looked at the criteria of the course outline that I showed you in the very beginning in terms of the vulnerabilities, in terms of all the different aspects of how you evaluate this, turns out they're exactly the same things we've been doing all along. And I was kind of using this IPS container as a test case, as a case study of how this criteria has been the same. It hasn't changed. But we haven't responded to it as effectively as we could. And this is what we're having the class today here to discuss and to try to inform you on this a little bit. But also, we did a couple of other things. We'll go ahead here. This is what it looks like. Now, the whole idea is this is a concept that we came up, although the government doesn't like the phrase because it's not quite what it is, but it's close, but it gives you a good indication of what it does, is we've trademarked the name SCIF in a Box. And that's probably as good a description as you're going to find on it. Because why? Because now we're looking at, we don't care about the room. We don't care about the space. We don't even care who's in the room. That's not the threat. The threat is the network equipment that's in the safe and who has access to it and when. And so what we focus on is protecting that network equipment. So basically, a simple design. I'm just a simple mechanical engineer, so it's not a lot of high-tech stuff here. We just cool equipment, we rack mount it, and we cable it. And all we do is provide a secure way of physically doing that so that nobody can break into the safe, that it still is a GSA Class 5 safe. But you now have the ability of making it an armored computer cabinet. You now can put whatever equipment you want in it. And the whole key is to make it agnostic, to make it impervious to the technology and the hardware that's advancing. Because now you have a platform that you can take forward that doesn't obsolete itself. And so this was a good test case, and it really kind of mirrors my history in terms of how this evolved to see how we can bring it forward to today and make it work. We also, part of it was getting into general officer quarters. It came to us, and again, we have practitioners that have really driven our technology. We really didn't necessarily invent it. We just listened to our customers. We listened to practitioners because the policy people are always a decade behind where technology and where the practitioners are moving. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up in creating again, you have to have place utility for this. The SIPRNet isn't any good if it's not where you need it. If a general has to go down to a vault somewhere in order to just do email, we get into this time factor. his performance is affected, his ability to respond. And normally either he'll send an aide down to do it or he doesn't do it. But there are all kinds of these physical barriers that get in the way. So what we've done is taken, first of all, we took this IPS container and scaled it for different sizes so that you could adapt it to the networked environment. It's not a one-size-fits-all environment that GSA would like it to be. It's really, from a network point of view, it's got to be tailored to whether it's single seat count, whether it's a low seat count workspace, or whether it's a bullpen. And you have to adapt to all those things. And you know, every one of you have an entirely different setup on your desk than anybody else. And it's up to us to adapt to you, not you to adapt to us or to the physical constraints. It's also imperative that we bring the network to you instead of you having to go to the network, because it's too big, it's too important, and you're now totally dependent on the information that you get from it to do your job. So we came up with this particular device. This particular one happens to reside in General Abrams' home at FORSCOM. We've also put these out at PACOM as well, and they're in the general officer quarters there. There is the Deputy General Crutchfield. When I installed it, and this is just a sidebar here. When I installed it, we went through the thing and we had this set up so that he could have instant SIPRNet access. He also had his VTC terminal there. He had his red switch phone. He had a voice over IP phone, and had all the toys all in one little room. And we went through the training. And the other critical part about, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit more, about this IPS container is the access environment to it. Because what you want is you want the user to have access to the network, but not the network equipment. That's the key to this. So when he sat down and he said, okay, I want to get up my Outlook and do my email, we sat down and said, okay, we're going to log them on. Now, what we have done to enhance the design of the IPS container, because it's basically a dumb platform, the key is how you access the network through it. You have a front end that is associated with the user interface. How do you allow that user to get access to the network without having to open the safe, without having to fiddle around with cables, without having to have a Dropbox and open a padlock and go to a safe and pull out a laptop and plug it in and then get online and then wait 10, 20 minutes for your antiviral updates. And then once you get that done, then you can turn around and reverse the process. You can then unplug it, put it back in the safe. The big critical thing that's the fallacy of that is now the data and the laptop and your network connection is offline. So the stability of the network comes in question because you're going on and off and on and off and on and off. What you want to do is you want to stay on all the time. You want to give them access to the network, but you want to have a stable network environment so that you can, again, you're consolidating space, everything's within the safe. You're consolidating time because your response time now becomes instant. So when I got done doing this training, what we had done is we've developed a solution that's an additional two-factor authentication to enable you to just turn the keyboard, monitor, mouse on and off. Keep the equipment running in the safe, turn the keyboard, monitor, mouse on and off, and that's all you have to do. We have a CAC pin set up to do that. And the other half of that equation, though, is protecting the safe and the network equipment itself. Remember I said we're a SCIF in a box. Well, a SCIF has an intrusion detection. It's got physical constraints in order to protect its contents. And so the other half of that is to have a remote monitor and control system of not just the safe body and the door opening and closing, but the key to physical security now is that lock. It's now an X10 lock, started out in X07 in 1989, basically fundamentally the same lock. It's worked well. That's not a threat vector at this point. The threat vector is the insider, who either knows the combo and can get into the safe or has access to the network. So when you have the combination of an access control system on the front end and the ability of remotely monitoring the equipment inside and the lock and the door of the safe on the back end, You now have a seamless user to the cloud interface, which is proactive. It prevents someone from, first of all, you restrict them to get in the first place. But if they attempt to, we can monitor the rotation of the lock. So we don't care what the combo is. We don't care who it is. We don't care what their intent is. As soon as they turn that spin dial, they're considered a threat. But the beauty of this design, and again, what you try to do is you're trying to look at information management. How do you control the information between you and the network? And so what you can also do is you can send a command back that shuts the system down before they can even get in. So they're dialing the combo, but even the process of doing that, spinning it up to get enough electricity to turn it and all that kind of stuff, within that minute or so, you can send a command down to a dispatch center. They can say, wait a minute, someone's getting in at 11 o'clock at night. This is not acceptable. And so they can send a command back, and we power everything off. So there is no network connection anymore. Switch is off. There is no laptop or data. There is no even crypto. And in fact, we've even worked it out so you can actually take the crypto and zeroize it. So you have now a proof positive, proactive response before they have access to anything. Now, when General Crutchfield was all done with this training, we had everything set up, he walked up, shook my hand. It was a surprise to me, but it goes back to time factor. He said, Bob, I have to thank you. I have to thank you because I'm on the road all week. I'm flying all over the Pac Rim. I get in late Friday night. I've got a ton of emails and reports I got to do on Saturday, and maybe 2, 3 in the afternoon I can come up for air. And then I got to get prepared for leaving on Sunday night or Monday for his next week of trips. But he said, your ability to give me instant SIPRNet access, to give me all my comm stuff, he can sit there and get online, and his aide is sitting up at Camp Smith, and he's talking to him at the same time he's doing email, and he can be on Nipper and Sipper, and he can be communicating over a VoCIT phone or whatever. All his comms are all in one area. Yeah, it's a pretty desk. That's for his wife mostly, or to allow him to have it in the house. But the point is, you want to have the ability of allowing him to communicate real time to get his job done. And the reason he thanked me was he said, Bob, you just bought me about 3 or 4 hours every Saturday of time I can spend with my kids. I can go to soccer practice. I can be with my family. That's invaluable to him. You can't calculate those things. So there's a lot of this that's not only technology, it's not only guns, gates, guards, and dogs. It's people. It's that human side of things that if you make security robust, but yet convenient, first of all, they'll use it. If it's convenient and it's simple and straightforward. If it's simple enough of putting a CAC card in, entering a little pin that's locally controlled right at the safe, that's over and above your SIPR token. He logs on, bingo, instant access. No boot up delays, nothing's off. Why? Because the system's on and running. It's stable and running 24/7. It's always up to date. And then the ability of just pulling a card and walking away. No opening of safes, no opening of drop boxes, either they do it or Nate does it, somebody has to do it. It's a complete waste of time. Just kills productivity, but it also kills your attitude because over time, the human nature is they're going to get lazy. They're going to find a way of keeping the system on. So they'll have like a KVM switch with Nipper and Sipper, and they'll just switch over to the Nipper side and leave the Sipper connected so that they can kind of shunt the system. We fixed that problem because we put a motion sensor in front of the desktop, so there's got to be a human being there. He can't get up and walk away from it. So what you do with little add-ons is you kind of funnel his behavior and funnel this, but it's in a way that is not only secure for the tech or for the commo team guy to deal with, but it's also convenient because he can instantly get on and instantly get off. And so they're encouraged to be compliant. And this is what these kind of things do. Now, a couple things I mentioned, cryptography is now enabling things that because of the spread of where things are, There's a push, a combination between type 1 crypto, and as I said, this was the driving engine for computer development in the first place, going back to Alan Turing in the 30s. If you saw the movie The Imitation Game, that was a very good story about his life. And of course, you're driven by, in that case, it was cracking the Enigma machine. But the point is that technology was driven by encryption. And that has changed because now the commercial side, what they call CSFC, Commercial Solutions for Classified, is trying to look at the cost and the management of crypto to get it to be more usable. So you've got different things going on in different paths, but the whole point about having a repository that is basically a network enclave is now you don't have to worry about any encryption, red-black separation or all this stuff because it's all kept within the safe. So you solve a lot of the encryption problems. Now, one of the issues that's coming up with CSFC is how do you manage it, because they're now putting it in the hands of the local commands. They're putting it back in the hands of the humans, so you give them more choices. And you may not want to do that. You have to manage that. If something goes wrong, how do you fix it? But again, what we try to do is we try to marry the technology, marry the physical security aspects in a way that's complementary to what you want to do from a network point of view. And the fact that with quantum computing coming along, the volume, the scale of things now just accelerates because of the number of users that are out there and because of the number of potential access points and the sheer volume of data that you're dealing, your exposure, even though the likelihood you try to keep down, the consequences off the charts. And that's what really defines your risk evaluation, how you create, as Terry said, what he called it, the security was basically a complex risk algorithm. And that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to mitigate those pieces. And that's what we're doing here. So, a couple things, just some observations along the way that I've come up with over, what I'm telling you, by the way, is this is an accumulated experience of like 30 years. So I guess I can say it took me 30 years to be an overnight success, right? But the point being that this is something that evolves. It evolved because we listen to our customers, we listen to the practitioners, we deal with policy when we have to. But the point is that you're trying to go through an evaluation process of defining security, looking at the threats, looking at are you compliant, but yet are you able to communicate and to do it securely. And so a couple things that happen along the way. That the threats, of course, are constantly changing. We don't know what we're up against. And we are looking at, from an endpoint point of view, of marrying the network, or actually marrying the user more to the network rather than the facility. And the way you work that is that by providing a simple, convenient user interface. This has just come back time and time again. And the fact that you want to have a solution that's technology and hardware independent. So no matter what the next technology is, you've got a platform that doesn't obsolete itself. And the problem with policy is things are always being looked at in the rearview mirror. They're always looking at fighting the last battle, fighting the last war, looking at the last threat. Just look at how TSA reacts to whatever bomber tried to do. Thank goodness the guy over Detroit who had something in his underwear didn't affect their policy that way. I mean, it was getting very invasive between laptops and liquids and everything else. But the point is, cybersecurity can't handle this alone. That there needs to be a physical security component to it, and that it needs to be something that you can basically inject into your operating environment, where you have a proactive piece on the physical side and you have the cyber side, which you have to work from the inside out so that you can work together. Also, a lot of problems you run into is you have technology basically for technology's sake. The computer industry is replete with companies, big ones like DEC, Compaq, others. Sun even got bought out by Oracle. Why? Because they relied on the technology to define their markets, not looking at marketing. That's why people like IBM have survived. Oracle has survived because they look to their customer base, they look to their markets. And the government is something that is not only a market, they can be the solution, but they can also be the problem. And as technology moves at the speed of light, you lead, follow, or you get out of the way. And part of it is trying to look at a coherent or a coherent policy for physical security that allows you to allow the security to be maintained while technology continues to advance. A small thing I'm going through, just wanted to remind you here, is we went through this criteria and we looked at what we were doing. There was a gentleman who was a captain in the Air Force. When I first brought the safe out, his name was John McCumber, and he had developed this evaluation criteria called the McCumber Cube. And it turns out that what happened was the criteria that he set up, you've all seen the confidentiality, availability, and integrity, that came from this model. 1991 was when we were first trying to get the safe approved. So I was trying to define where's the market for this. And John was extremely helpful. And it turns out that the same criteria of how we're evaluating cryptography, how we're evaluating network security, how we're looking at how it applies to the host computer, the network, both from the inside out and the outside in, and how you look at applications, how you look at policy, and how you look at access control, are exactly the same criteria that he went through. Now, I've gone through most of what is left here already, but the big changes that took place in the 90s was that the computer became the network, and the network became the computer, because now it's all spread out, and it's not in one room in one place. So the big threat we have to look at is scale matters. It's a function of what you have, all these nodes out there, multiple users, volumes of data, but it only takes one to compromise it. And that's the challenge that we face today. So I'm going to step through this. We've been through most of these points already. So I think we're running out of time here. But I wanted you to look at the fact that you want to be seamless. You want to integrate that physical security. You want to marry it in a way that in fact, there's one last slide here I just want to go through, because we have looked at all this from the security point of view, from the user point of view, and from a policy point of view, the fact that traditional countermeasures have not worked. And they're static, they're there, but they have to be brought into the 21st century. And that's what we're looking at doing here. I've talked about these things. SCIFs are just big, expensive, can't move them, they're fixed. Networks moving, changing all the time, the facility is there. Now we're looking at another round of BRAC, what do you do? And so this whole concept of the IPS container. One other thing they're looking at now too is having kind of a lighter way of doing it. Instead of a big, heavy, expensive safe, they're looking at a tamper-proof environment. Just keeping honest people honest, or protecting people from themselves. Or if you want to get crude about it, don't allow stupid. That you have to control that human element, and that's vitally important. So this was what this IPS container looks like. I've gone through most of what it is, and Here's how it ends up being integrated. Here is a tamper-proof example of a workstation where now you can secure the keyboard, monitor, mouse on the desktop. You can do that with a key lock. But now that coupled with your access control, which can be two-factor authentication, plus your CIPRNet token, gives you defense in depth, gives you a multi-layer level of security. And other things that we have associated with the balancing now of endpoint security. You want to be robust, transparent, simple, effective, secure yet convenient, and all these other that you see here. Seamless yet hardware independent is quite important. You also got to be adaptable. So that being practical and policy compliant, we're now looking at the bottom line. SCIFs are a network portal. They don't solve these problems. You need to have an alternative that enables you to focus on the network equipment, focus on the user interface. And the final question is, because security is a perception, okay? Does your security officer sleep well at night? Because he's the one that has to manage from the wall to the desktop. And he's the one that has to integrate all these functions and is accountable for it, but unfortunately doesn't have a lot of policy that enables him to get the job done. And we're just here to try to help him. I'll end with this. Wayne Gretzky. He always skates to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been. Now, any questions from anybody? That either means I did a really good job or I got you completely lost, right? Yes.
I'll just mention that I managed networks in Europe for back in the 90s and the 2000s and had 11 networks in Europe. Can we use the microphone?
Oh, here. If they have that.
I was just going to mention that I spent about 22 years in Europe. Can you hear me okay? And my life changed. I worked together with Bob. I'm not part of his company, but I work with technology with him. And as a systems administrator running multiple networks in 11 different nations of Europe, I can personally speak to the fact that overnight my life changed after we installed these and made our equipment stay up 24 hours a day, because our networks extended all the way from Naples to Oslo, Norway, and it was very difficult. There were just two of us at the time administrating all these networks. And this technology enormously changed our workload. We just all of a sudden gained an unbelievable stability. And when he talked about red-black separation and the ability to solve problems, when you put things inside that safe, it just, whether they be switches or whatever it is, it just simplifies your architecture. And you should think a lot about when you're architecting your networks and your systems, anytime you can simplify the administration of those networks, you're gaining enormous amounts of resources and time for your staff. So I just wanted to mention that, a real practical experience that I've had with this technology.
Well, with that being said, thank you all for being here. And I thank AFCEA for giving us the opportunity. Hopefully this has helped open up your minds a little bit to some of the problems, particularly at the endpoint, that it is very important. And I appreciate you all coming out today. Thank you very, very much.